900 years ago, this was nothing but a forest clearing beside a river. No walls, no palaces, no power, just wolves, wooden huts, and a name no one outside these woods had ever heard. And yet, from this insignificant patch of mud, an empire would rise that would burn, freeze, starve, survive, and eventually shake the entire world. This is the story of Moscow, the city that refused to die. Picture the year 1147. There is no Kremlin, no red square, no golden domes catching the morning light. There is only a small hill above a slow, brown river, ringed by dense birch forest, stretching in every direction for hundreds of miles. Somewhere out there, wolves howl. Somewhere closer, smoke rises from a cluster of log cabins, a trading outpost so minor that most chronicles of the time don't even bother to mention it. But something is about to change. A prince named Yuri Dolgoruky, his name literally means Yuri Longarm, because his ambition reached farther than his rivals ever expected, has just invited a fellow nobleman to a feast on this obscure hilltop. It is a small, forgettable gathering. Except it isn't. Because this is the first time in recorded history that the word Moscow is written down. No one at that feast could have imagined what would come next. Not the fires, not the invasions, not the empire, not the Cold War standoffs, or the red stars glowing over the Kremlin at midnight. All of that begins here, in mud, timber, and smoke. This is a journey through nearly 900 years of blood, ambition, faith, fire, and rebirth. By the end, you'll understand how a forest outpost became one of the most powerful cities on Earth, and why, no matter how many times history tried to erase it, Moscow always came back. In its earliest decades, Moscow is barely a city at all. It's a wooden fortress, a Kremlin, meaning simply fortified enclosure, built from felled birch and pine, encircled by earthen walls and a moat filled with river water. Inside, life is harsh and short. Winters bury the settlement in snow for nearly half the year. Disease moves through the cramped wooden houses like a whisper, turning into a scream. And always, always, there is the fear of what lies beyond the tree line. Because Moscow sits in a dangerous position, a crossroads of trade routes, yes, but also a target. To the east and south, on the endless grass of the steppe, a storm is gathering that no one in these wooden walls can yet imagine. In 1237, that storm arrives. The Mongols, under the grandsons of Genghis Khan, sweep across Russia with a speed and brutality that shatters every principality in their path. City after city falls. Moscow, still a minor settlement, is burned to the ground in 1238. Its wooden walls, the same walls meant to protect it, become fuel for the flames. Survivors flee into the forest, watching their homes collapse into ash and embers behind them. For the next 240 years, Moscow and all of Russia will live under what history calls the Tatar yoke. Mongol Khans demand tribute. Russian princes are forced to travel to the Golden Horde's capital just to receive permission to rule their own cities. It is humiliation stitched into daily life. But here is the twist that changes everything. Moscow's princes, rather than resisting the Mongols outright, learn to work within the system. They become the Khan's most reliable tax collectors, and in doing so, quietly siphon wealth, favor, and power away from their rival cities. While other Russian principalities weaken under Mongol rule, Moscow grows stronger, slowly, patiently, almost invisibly. By the late 1300s, something remarkable happens. In 1380, a Muscovite prince named Dmitry Donskoy leads a coalition of Russian forces against the Golden Horde at the Battle of Kulikovo, and wins. It isn't the end of Mongol rule, but it is the first crack in the ice. For the first time in over a century, Russians believe the Mongols can be beaten, and the city leading that belief is Moscow. The wooden fortress on the hill is no longer just surviving, it's about to start ruling. By the late 1400s, the balance of power has shifted entirely. Grand Prince Ivan III, later remembered as Ivan the Great, formally rejects Mongol authority in 1480, and no army comes to punish him. The Tatar yoke, 2.5 centuries of subjugation, simply ends. Not with a final apocalyptic battle, but with a quiet standoff at a river called the Ugra, where two armies face each other for weeks and then simply withdraw. Moscow is free, and Ivan intends to make sure the world notices. He imports Italian architects from Renaissance Italy, men who had worked on the cathedrals of Florence and Milan, and commissions them to rebuild the wooden Kremlin in red brick and white stone. Towers rise, fortified walls, over 2 kilometers long, encircle the hill. Golden domes begin to glimmer above the skyline for the first time. What was once a fortress of fear becomes a fortress of glory. And then Ivan makes an even bolder claim. Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire and the heart of Orthodox Christianity for over 1,000 years, has just fallen to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. In the chaos that follows, Ivan marries Sophia Palaiologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor. Suddenly, Moscow isn't just a regional power. It's positioning itself as the successor to Rome itself, a third Rome, carrying the torch of empire and faith after the first Rome fell to barbarians and the second, Constantinople, fell to the Turks. It's a breathtaking claim for a city that was burned to ash just 200 years earlier. But Ivan's grandson will push that ambition even further, and in doing so, become one of the most feared names in Russian history. His name is Ivan IV. History will remember him as Ivan the Terrible. In 1547, at just 16 years old, Ivan IV is crowned not merely as Grand Prince, but as Tsar, a title derived from Caesar itself. It is the first time any Russian ruler has claimed the title, and it signals an ambition that borders on obsession. This is a man who genuinely believes he answers to God alone. For years, his reign brings genuine progress. Law codes are reformed. Russia's borders expand eastward into Siberia and southward toward the Caspian Sea. St. Basil's Cathedral rises beside the Kremlin walls, its impossible swirl of colorful onion domes designed to celebrate military victory. A building so strange and beautiful that legend claims Ivan blinded its architects afterward, so they could never build anything to rival it again. Historians debate whether that story is true, but the fact that people believed it tells you everything about how Ivan was perceived. Then, in 1560, his beloved wife Anastasia dies, and something inside Ivan breaks. Convinced that the boyars, Russia's noble class, have poisoned her, Ivan descends into a paranoia that will define the rest of his reign. He creates a private army called the Oprichnina, men dressed in black, riding black horses, carrying the symbol of a dog's head and a broom, signifying their purpose: to sniff out treason and sweep it away. What follows is a reign of terror, unlike anything Moscow has seen. Nobles are executed on suspicion alone. Entire towns are massacred for perceived disloyalty. And in one devastating moment of rage in 1581, Ivan strikes his own son and heir with a scepter, killing him. The dynasty he built his empire around begins to crumble in that single moment of violence. When Ivan dies in 1584, he leaves behind an empire vastly expanded and a succession crisis that will nearly destroy everything he built. The years that follow will be remembered simply as the time of troubles, and they will bring Moscow closer to complete annihilation than the Mongols ever did. Between 1598 and 1613, Russia collapses into chaos. Ivan's bloodline dies out, Impostors claiming to be resurrected princes rise and fall. Famine grips the land so severely that reports describe desperate Muscovites turning to cannibalism just to survive the winters. And into this power vacuum march foreign armies. Polish and Swedish forces sensing an empire ripe for the taking. In 1610, the unthinkable happens. Polish troops occupy the Kremlin itself, the heart of Russian Orthodox identity. The symbol of Ivan's Third Rome sits under a foreign flag. For a moment, it seems entirely possible that Russia as an independent nation simply ceases to exist. But something remarkable happens instead. A merchant named Kuzma Mainin and a prince named Dmitry Pozharsky raise a volunteer army, not soldiers ordered into battle, but ordinary Russians choosing to fight for a city and an identity worth saving. In 1612, this citizen army liberates Moscow, expelling the Polish garrison street by street. The following year, a young nobleman named Michael Romanov is crowned Tsar. A new dynasty begins. It will rule Russia for the next 304 years. Moscow rebuilds. It grows. Markets flourish beneath the Kremlin walls. Foreign merchants establish trading posts. And the city becomes not just a political capital, but a genuine metropolis of the Russian world. But its greatest test, and its most legendary act of defiance, is still to come. And it involves a fire so vast it will become one of the most famous acts of self-destruction in human history. By 1712, Moscow suffers a humiliation that seems, at first, like the end of its story entirely. Peter the Great, the reformist Tsar, obsessed with turning Russia into a modern European power, moves the capital from Moscow to a brand new city built from nothing on the swampy Baltic coast, St. Petersburg. For the next 200 years, Moscow is no longer the seat of power. It becomes, in the eyes of the elite, the old capital, the past. And then, in 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte invades Russia with the largest army Europe has ever assembled. Over 600,000 men marching east with one goal: total conquest. Russian forces cannot stop him. City after city falls. And in September of 1812, Napoleon's exhausted army finally marches into Moscow, expecting the keys to the city, a formal surrender, warm shelter for the coming winter. Instead, they find it almost empty. Moscow's governor has ordered a mass evacuation, and then, in one of the most audacious acts of defiance in military history, allowed the city to be set ablaze. Fires break out across wooden districts, fanned by autumn winds, and within days, 75% of Moscow burns to the ground. Napoleon watches from the Kremlin walls as the city he thought he'd conquered turns to smoke and ruin beneath him. There is no surrender to accept, no warm shelter, no supplies to plunder, just ash. Trapped in a burned, hostile city with winter closing in, Napoleon is forced to retreat. That retreat becomes one of the greatest military catastrophes in history. His grand army, torn apart by starvation, disease, and the brutal Russian winter, is reduced from over 500,000 men to a broken fraction limping back across the border. Moscow burned itself down rather than let an emperor rule it. And somehow, from those ashes, it will rise larger than ever before. The 19th century transforms Moscow from a burned relic into an industrial giant. Railways connect it to every corner of the empire. Factories rise along the riverbanks, drawing waves of peasants from the countryside into overcrowded tenements. Merchants build extravagant mansions. The Bolshoi Theater fills nightly with the sound of ballet and opera. On the surface, Moscow gleams with imperial confidence, but beneath that gleam, something dangerous is fermenting. Factory workers labor 12-14 hours a day for wages that barely feed their families. Political dissidents whisper of revolution in secret rooms. And in February 1917, that whisper becomes a roar. The Tsarist government collapses. Months of chaos follow, culminating in October 1917 when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seize power in a coup that will reshape the entire 20th century. In 1918, Lenin makes a decision that reverses 200 years of imperial policy. He moves the capital back to Moscow. St. Petersburg, soon renamed Petrograd, then Leningrad, is deemed too vulnerable, too close to hostile borders. Moscow, the old capital, the burned capital, the backward capital, compared to the glittering imperial court on the Baltic, becomes the beating heart of the world's first communist state. And under Bolshevik and then Stalinist rule, it will be transformed into something the world has never seen before. Under Joseph Stalin, Moscow undergoes one of the most radical urban transformations any city has ever experienced. Ancient churches, monasteries, and imperial landmarks, symbols of a religious, aristocratic past Stalin once erased, are demolished by the hundreds. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior, one of Moscow's grandest religious buildings, is dynamited in 1931 to make way for a planned palace of Soviets. Meant to be the tallest building on Earth, topped with a statue of Lenin larger than the Statue of Liberty. That palace is never finished. But other Stalinist ambitions are. Beneath the streets, an underground marvel begins construction, the Moscow Metro. Unlike subway systems anywhere else in the world, Stalin insists these stations be built as palaces for the people. Vast marble halls, gleaming chandeliers, mosaic ceilings depicting Soviet triumphs, as if commuters were descending into an underground museum rather than simply catching a train. Some stations remain among the most beautiful pieces of architecture on the planet to this day. Above ground, 7 massive skyscrapers rise across the city. The Seven Sisters, ornate wedding cake towers built to prove that Soviet architecture could rival, even surpass, the capitalist skylines of the West. But even as Moscow gleams with new monuments, a darker machinery operates in the shadows. The Great Purge of the 1930s sees hundreds of thousands arrested, executed, or sent to Siberian labor camps on suspicion of disloyalty to Stalin. Fear becomes, once again, as it was under Ivan the Terrible centuries earlier, a tool of governance. And then, in 1941, an external threat returns, one that will bring Moscow closer to falling than at any point since Napoleon. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, hurling over 3 million German troops across the Soviet border. Their ultimate target? Moscow. Hitler's planners believe the war can be won before winter, that the Soviet capital will fall within weeks. By October 1941, German forces are close enough to Moscow that soldiers can reportedly see the glint of the Kremlin's spires through their field binoculars. Panic grips the city. Government offices begin evacuating. Some citizens flee eastward in a chaotic exodus, later remembered as the Great Scare. For a moment, it seems as though the city that survived Mongols, Poles, and Napoleon might finally fall. But Stalin refuses to leave. On November 7, 1941, with German troops just kilometers from the city limits, Soviet leadership holds a defiant military parade through Red Square, soldiers marching past Lenin's tomb and then directly to the front lines, a deliberate act of propaganda broadcasting one message to the world: Moscow will not fall. And it doesn't. Reinforced by fresh Siberian divisions and aided by one of the harshest winters in decades, temperatures plunging so low that German tank engines freeze solid and rifles crack in soldiers' hands, the Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941 pushes German forces back from the capital's doorstep. It is the first major defeat Hitler's army suffers in the entire war, and it happens at the gates of Moscow. The city that burned itself for Napoleon now freezes out Hitler. Moscow survives once again, but the cost of the wider war will be almost unimaginable, with the Soviet Union ultimately losing more lives than any other nation in the conflict. Behind the Iron Curtain. After 1945, Moscow becomes the nerve center of a new kind of global conflict, one fought not with tanks crossing borders, but with ideology, propaganda, and the looming shadow of nuclear annihilation. The Cold War transforms the Kremlin into arguably the most watched building on Earth, its every light and shadow analyzed by intelligence agencies thousands of miles away. Within Moscow itself, life under late Soviet rule is a study in contrasts. Grand government buildings and space program monuments celebrate Soviet achievements. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, launched into orbit in 1961, returns to a hero's welcome in Red Square that draws hundreds of thousands. Yet ordinary citizens wait in long lines for basic goods, live in cramped communal apartments, and navigate a system where a single careless comment about the government could end a career. Or worse, the city becomes a paradox, a capital projecting limitless confidence to the outside world, while quietly straining under economic stagnation at home. By the 1980s, that strain becomes impossible to hide. Mikhail Gorbachev introduces reforms, glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring, hoping to save the Soviet system by loosening its grip. Instead, the reforms expose cracks that can no longer be papered over. In August 1991, hardline communist officials attempt a coup against Gorbachev. Tanks roll into central Moscow. And in one of the defining images of the 20th century, ordinary Muscovites, students, office workers, grandmothers, pour into the streets and surround the tanks, refusing to move, refusing to be intimidated. The coup collapses within 3 days. 4 months later, on December 25th, Soviet flag is lowered from the Kremlin for the final time. The Soviet Union ceases to exist. Moscow, the city that had been the capital of communism for 74 years, must now reinvent itself yet again. The 1990s bring a chaotic, often brutal transition. State industries are privatized almost overnight, creating a handful of extraordinarily wealthy oligarchs, while millions of ordinary Russians watch their savings evaporate in hyperinflation. Organized crime flourishes in the vacuum left by collapsing state institutions. For a time, Moscow feels less like the capital of a superpower and more like a city teetering on the edge of its own time of troubles. But once again, the city stabilizes. Once again, it rebuilds. Oil wealth and economic reform bring a construction boom in the 2000s. The Moscow International Business Center, a cluster of glass skyscrapers nicknamed Moscow City, rises on the skyline, an unmistakable symbol that Moscow now competes not just as a political capital, but as a global financial one. Luxury boutiques open beneath centuries-old arcades. High-speed trains connected across the continent. Red Square, the same ground where Ivan the Terrible built St. Basil's, where Napoleon watched the city burn, where Stalin held his defiant wartime parade, now hosts international pop concerts and ice skating rinks in winter. Today, Moscow stands as one of the largest, wealthiest, and most architecturally striking cities on Earth, home to more billionaires than almost any other city in the world. Its ancient Kremlin walls now surrounded by glass towers that would have been unimaginable to the peasants who once feared this hill as nothing more than a fortress in the woods. Stand in Red Square today, and you can feel almost every layer of this story beneath your feet. The wooden fortress that burned under Mongol torches, the red brick walls raised by Ivan the Great's Italian architects, the the colorful chaos of St. Basil's domes, the ashes Napoleon found where a city should have been, the marble palaces built underground for Soviet commuters, the tanks that rolled in, and the citizens who stood in front of them and refused to move. 900 years. Invasions, fires, purges, revolutions, collapses, and rebirths. And yet, every single time history tried to erase this city from the map, it came back, larger, stronger, and more determined than before. That's the real story of Moscow. Not a city that never suffered, a city that never stayed down. If you enjoyed this journey through 9 centuries of fire and rebirth, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the cities and civilizations that shaped our world. And let us know in the comments, which city's history should we uncover next?